Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. We're continuing our little series looking at small bits of the Bible that have a pretty outsized impact on theology or church, the way we kind of do things. So last week, we talked about a bit of a heavier one, about the idea of whether or not Christians have been instructed to be polite or to be nice. And generally, yes, we are to be kind, to respect one another, to show that respect in the way that we interact with one another. But there is a level of two sides to that kind of politeness that has sort of crept into modern Christianity. And one side is a bit of a insidious nature of politeness that turns things into judgment. So it becomes a way of kind of differentiating who's kind of good and who's good enough to really be a good Christian and who's not, and who's kind of more uncouth. But then it's also made the church kind of too toothless to do things about a lot of issues of injustice, because we're so focused on being nice and being polite and just kind of being decent people that we lose sight of the larger fight against the kind of systems and powers of this world that are persecuting people, that are exploiting people, that are harming our environment and the rest of our world. And in our quest to be nice, we lose that edge that it takes to kind of fight against injustice. So this week I want to do something a little bit lighter. And this, I want to talk a little bit about where the idea of having church on a Sunday comes from, and whether or not that's really commanded in the Bible or not. Sometimes we feel like that is the kind of thing that we must do, is church on a Sunday. That's a very Christian thing to do as well. So I want to walk through a few verses, because there's not really one place at all that says that we should meet together on a Sunday. In fact, there's not really anything that says we should meet together weekly. There's certainly not anything that says how often we should have communion either. Some churches do it pretty often. Catholic churches do it every time they meet together, sometimes with a Tuesday through Sunday Mass, and then Monday might be a communion where you use previously consecrated elements, but the other times where it is Mass, it is consecrated by priest. Some churches in the Church of Scotland will do it once a month. Some, like our church in Ellen, does it only a couple of times a year, or on special events, things like that. I grew up in a church that does it, and still does it every single Sunday. But it's just kind of up to the church. And so here's a few things that will tell us a bit about why that is, or maybe why that isn't the case. So one of the first verses I want to talk about is Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. And we talked about this fairly recently in a sermon that Alistair preached at church. And this verse is about, it basically says, do not neglect meeting together, as some people have done. So this one just says, don't forget to meet together. So this is the idea that being a Christian is not done in isolation. You do meet together, you do gather. But there's nothing about how often or when in the week to do that, or what you do when you gather together. Just as gather together. So it could be a small group, could be something else. Another verse where we get this idea, Acts 2, verse 46. It says, and this is about the early church, the very early church. Day by day they spent much time together and broke bread at home. The time they were spending together at that time, again, very early on in the church, was at the temple, in the temple courts. But then they broke bread together at home. And breaking bread in the New Testament can, depending on the context or depending on how much you want to read into it, it can either mean they ate a meal together, or it could mean they took the Lord's Supper and they did a more formalized remembrance of Jesus with bread and wine and that sort of thing. So again, they spent much time together, but at that time they were all still in Jerusalem, and they broke bread at home. So they weren't meeting in a church or synagogue or anything like that. Then later on in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, it says, this is Paul sort of narrating, on the first day of the week when we met to break bread. And so this is Paul and his companions, or perhaps it's even Luke narrating, who's present with them, on the first day of the week when we met to break bread. So this sort of signifies that maybe that was their regular ritual. That doesn't necessarily mean that that was the regular ritual of every church or everyone in the Christian world at that time, but that was maybe their ritual on the first day of the week, which is Sunday. So they were gathering, but it doesn't say that's what you should do. It's just describing events. So that's where we get maybe the closest to this idea of meeting together on a Sunday and communion involved. Then another pretty important verse with this is Revelation 1, verse 10, and this is John narrating on the Isle of Patmos, and he says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day." And so now we see this is now quite a few years on from where Paul is writing, maybe 30 years on from what Paul is doing. And we have this idea of the Lord's Day now taking over, which then takes over from the first day of the week because Jesus was raised on Sunday. And so that is, then now we have this shift to kind of, rather than it just being the first day of the week after the Sabbath, it's taking on a special significance. And then in 1 Corinthians 11, in the famous passage where Paul describes the Lord's Supper, it's one of the places outside of the Gospels where we have the narration of Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper. It just says, when you come together as a church and break bread. Again, no kind of time element to it, no sense of like do it weekly, do it monthly, do it whatever. And then there's later on in 1 Corinthians 11 as well, it just says, for as often as you eat this bread. Again, just whenever you do it. So these are just a few of the verses. There might be one or two more that kind of play into this idea. But there's nothing specifically in the New Testament that says that we should meet together on a Sunday where we worship and where communion is involved. But that has become the standard practice of the church through time, through traditions, again, through some verses like these where it's on the first day of the week, they're meeting, they're breaking bread, and you start to see this pattern sort of develop. But it's never been specifically commanded in the New Testament that that's what should happen, or how frequently it should happen, or what. But these verses kind of all combine to give us a sense that on a Sunday, which then becomes, again, the Lord's Day, that special significance, they were meeting together. And as they were meeting together, they were often having communion, breaking bread together. And so that sort of just fits naturally, that worship on a Sunday, coming together as a church, and coming together as a church often to share communion, becomes part of the pattern of the church and becomes sort of codified as just what we do, and something that obviously Christians are exceptionally known for. So that's a bit of a run through about these sort of small verses that have had a bigger impact on how we live as Christians, considering that worship on a Sunday is maybe one of the biggest things that we do. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll catch you again next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.